It is mid-morning, August 25th, 1485, and on a wide plain south of the village of Market Bosworth, 3 armies have converged near an area of marsh ground to decide the matter of who is to wear the crown of England. While the 2 vanguards of the royal and the rebel armies engage in the centre, and the 3rd army remains aloof on the southeastern rise, King Richard sees his enemy, the usurper Henry Tudor, and calls his household guards to order. Donning his helmet, ringed with the gold crown, his face entirely covered, Richard leads 800 men in charging down from their rear position to assault the Tudor standard. They ride in an arc to avoid the heavy infantry battle, and with their steeds at full gallop, collide with a shocking crash into Henry's guard company. The force of the impact almost buckles Henry's formation immediately. Richard's lance knocks Henry's standard-bearer from the saddle onto the ground, where both man and flag are churned and crushed by metal-shod hooves. Next, Richard takes a mace and beats Sir John Cheney, one of England's foremost champions at the joust, out of his saddle with sheer terrible violence. All around them, a similar frenzy, as men form their own wars in miniature, every one of them fighting for life and the death of their enemy. Henry Tudor, inexperienced at warfare, never having fought a battle, is rooted to the spot by this ferociously precise savagery. He watches wide-eyed as armoured limbs are butchered from the shoulder, legs rent at the knee, blades and bludgeons move at a speed that he would have thought unimaginable. His eye fixes on the figure with the crowned helm, Richard, now barely more than a sword's length away, moving toward him like an unstoppable demon. Somewhere in his mind, Henry recognizes that this awful spectre is a king, but the flailing creature is more like an animal than a man. Before his last remaining bodyguards close around him, Henry sees Richard's helmet somehow knocked from his head, and he can behold the terrible face, the features contorted and twisted in rage. Nemesis, teeth bared like a wolf, spitting, howling, shrieking for Tudor blood. In that moment, Richard is the embodiment of every Plantagenet forebear. The terrible dynasty that conquered England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, France, and even brought their war to the Holy Land to defeat Saladin himself. Amidst this chaos, Henry seemed no more than a boy who foolishly thought to make himself one of these anointed kings, and now he will be ripped and torn asunder. Then, the bodyguard closes ranks. All goes dark. The sound of the battle only a muffled, watery rumble. This video is brought to you by Top Troops. Live your medieval fantasy and build a powerful army in a wickedly fun game. Top Troops is a new free-to-play RPG with merge elements and strategic gameplay, out now on iOS and Android. It launched just last month, and thousands of players are flocking to it thanks to wickedly fun game mechanics. In a nutshell, you need to defeat the Dark Army as your army builds in strength and you progress through the story. You can join a squad and compete with or against other players. Merge and level up your units to grow your army and knock down stronger enemies. Bring your units into epic massive battles where multiple strategies can unfold. Rebuild a land where you can train, interact with your troops, and farm resources. Challenge yourself and improve your troops as you move along the game and collect your favorite units. What I like is that Top Troops not only has interesting battles, but also various game modes. It's not a simple kingdom-building game, but also features the adventure mode, PvP, and a unique merge system, and if you're smart in how you position your troops, you can win against much stronger opponents. I have a link in the description for top troops. Using that link or the QR code on screen to download the game helps my channel, but also gives you in-game rewards for a limited time. 100 gems and King Chest size L. Download the game now through my link in the description or using the QR code and join the troops. It is August 7th, 1485, and Henry Tudor has landed with a force of 2,000 men at Dale, north of Milford Haven, on the Welsh coast. He is there to claim the throne of England for himself, taking it from Richard III, brother of the previous king, Edward. In the wake of Henry's first failed invasion a year and a half earlier, Richard has entrusted the protection of Wales to the Earl of Huntingdon in the southeast and further west to Rhys ap Thomas. But like Marshal Nye on Napoleon's return from Elba, the Welsh commander immediately goes over to the Tudor Lancastrian side and declares his commitment to Henry. The road to the north now open, Henry links up with his uncle Jasper, a veteran of the Wars of the Roses on the Lancastrian side, in opposition to Richard's Yorkist family, and with Rhys ap Thomas making his way first west and then north toward Newtown, Henry and Jasper's force initially follow along the coast to stay clear of Huntingdon, before turning east at Machynlleth and consolidating their forces with Rhys Thomas at Welshpool. By the 16th of August, the rebel army is at Newport. The day before that, Thomas, Lord Stanley and his brother Sir William Stanley set out from the towns of Latham and Holt in their northwestern power base and begin marching south also. Lord Stanley has been a supporter of King Richard's Yorkist cause for decades, and Richard holds his son George, Lord Strange, as a hostage, while the king also entrusted his brother Sir William Stanley with the protection of North Wales. But Lord Stanley is also stepfather to Henry Tudor through his marriage to Margaret Beaufort, and his son George is married to a Woodville, sister of the former queen, making her an aunt of the two young princes, Edward and Richard, who were last seen in the custody of their uncle in the summer of 1483. King Richard is rumoured to have murdered the children in the Tower of London, and this has bred disquiet among many of the southern English nobles. Commanding perhaps 2/3 the number of forces as Richard III, and likely slightly more than Henry Tudor, the Stanleys' participation in the battle might prove decisive. When Henry reaches Stafford on the 17th, Sir Thomas Stanley rides into his camp and is received along with a small bodyguard. He leaves again that night, and over the next 3 days the Stanleys shadow Henry's small army as it moves through Rudgley, Lichfield, Tamworth and Atherston. On the same day that Henry is at Newport, Richard's forces set out from London and Norfolk to rendezvous with the king, who is at his base in Nottingham. Additional royal forces are moving south from the king's Yorkist seat of power in Northumberland. Richard's army musters at Leicester on the 21st of August and sets out west, a wholly English force with the king riding at its head, moving at speed after Richard's scouts inform him that Henry Tudor is at Atherston, possibly staying at the 3 Tuns Inn or at the Abbey of Merivale. Richard likely crosses an ancient forest track north of the village of Earl Shilton and then camps with his forces for the night on Ambion Hill. The Stanleys are to the southwest, outside the village of Stapleton. The youngest of 4 surviving sons to the Duke of York, and steeped in the masculine traditions of high medieval chivalry, Richard is a martial warrior king who is contemptuous of Henry Tudor, a military novice and generally held to be unathletic in his bearing. Through his descent from John of Gaunt, Richard's father had sought to claim the throne from the unstable and incapable Henry VI in what became known as the Wars of the Roses, beginning in 1455. Richard's father and his second brother Edmund were killed by forces loyal to King Henry VI at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, after which Richard and his third brother were sent into the Low Countries for safety, but they returned following the victory of his eldest brother, 18-year-old Edward, at the Battle of Towton in 1461, and Edward was subsequently crowned king and reigned with one interruption for 23 years. At the age of 12, Richard is sent into the service of the Earl of Warwick, and the 1460s sees him learning his trade as a soldier and administrator along the Scottish border, assisting Warwick in the low-level conflict of raid and counter-raid that had prevailed in that icy and desolate region for centuries. His term of service with Warwick ends in 1470, when Warwick becomes resentful towards Edward and attempts to restore Henry VI. Both Edward and Richard are forced into exile in Flanders, but within a year they return to their home base in York, funded by Burgundian merchants, and rally their forces for a march on London. Warwick and Henry VI's support evaporates once more when his mental problems prove too great to conceal, and Edward enters London unopposed and retakes the throne. Henry is imprisoned. Edward, with Richard by his side, next defeats and kills the Earl of Warwick at the Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April 1471, and then on the 4th of May destroys another Lancastrian army and kills Henry VI's heir, Edward of Lancaster. That night, Richard and some of the prominent Yorkist supporters enter the Tower of London, where Henry VI is being held, and the next morning it is announced that the former king has died from what is described as melancholy. Richard plays a leading role over the next decade of his elder brother's reign, governing the north of England in his name, and even leading a force north to capture Berwick-on-Tweed and occupy the Scottish capital Edinburgh when war is declared in 1482. Edward, whose second son shares the same name as his brother, gives thanks in a letter to the Pope for our most loving brother, Richard, whose success is so proven that he alone would suffice to chasten the whole kingdom of Scotland. Dominic Mancini, an Italian monk and writer resident in England during the 1480s, says that such is Richard's renown in war that whenever a difficult and dangerous policy had to be undertaken, it would be entrusted to him. When Edward's lifestyle and distresses of kingship overcome him, and he dies on 9th of April 1483, Richard becomes Lord Protector of England and takes custody of Edward's 12-year-old son, also named Edward, arresting and executing the boy's uncle on his mother's side, Anthony Woodville, who had been escorting the young heir to London. After persuading the Privy Council of his honest intentions, Edward's second son, Prince Richard, aged 10, is taken from his mother, and both boys are lodged in the Tower of London. Under Richard's direction, the boys are declared illegitimate and thus ineligible to inherit the throne. They are last seen playing in the grounds of the Tower that summer, but they subsequently vanish, and there has never been a definitive answer as to what happened to them. Some contemporary accounts put their murder at the hands of Richard's ally, the Duke of Buckingham, as well as Richard himself, and Buckingham rebels that autumn, allying himself with Henry Tudor, who for 14 years has been in precarious exile in Brittany. Henry's claim to the throne comes from a weak relation to an illegitimate child of John of Gaunt, But he, and especially his mother Margaret Beaufort, are determined to pursue it. The rebellion of 1483 is a military failure, however, as Buckingham's Welsh troops cannot cross the Severn River after recent heavy rains and desert him. He is captured in Salisbury while trying to flee and beheaded there. Richard, now crowned king since June 1483, guards all of the ports, and Henry, with a small force of Bretons, cannot find a landing point for his ships and is forced by the bad weather to return to the French coast. Rather than costing support, however, Henry seems to have gained from the rebellion, as the regent of France, Anne de Beaujeu, acting on behalf of Charles VIII, offers support in the form of troops and money, while at the same time Richard suffers two tragic losses, with the death of his son and heir Edward of Middleham, the Prince of Wales, the following spring, and his wife just under a year later, in March 1485. With Henry in the ascendant and Richard losing support over his treatment of the princes in the Tower, and the executions of those nobles he deemed his enemies, as well as now lacking an heir, Richard needs to destroy Henry in battle before his rebellion gathers any further momentum and devolves into another drawn-out and ruinous civil conflict. The three forces converge when Henry's army begins to advance on a marshy plain a little over a mile southwest of Ambion Hill, spread either side of Fen Lane, the road linking the city of Leicester with the Roman Watling Street. The village of Market Bosworth is to the north, with the Stanleys moving southwest from their camp toward the villages of Dadlington and Stoke, on higher ground overlooking the battle. The Stanleys are standing on the clay from which the battle takes its other name, that of Reedmoor, from the reddish tinge of the ground. The River Sence runs to the north, and there is a wide marsh at the foot of the south slope of the hill. With the sun rising in the late summer sky, word reaches Richard that Henry is marching forward to engage him. This surprises the king, for not only does he hold the high ground, but also still possesses the numbers, perhaps twice as many fighting men as Henry Tudor. There is further confusion in Richard's army. Richard has not slept well and tells his men that in his dreams he imagined himself surrounded by demons. Riding to see Henry's army for himself from the crest of Ambion Hill, Richard returns to his headquarters to find that his chaplain is absent, and when the priest is finally found to give mass, there is no wine and bread to celebrate it, and this costs yet more time. The delay means that Richard and possibly even his army miss their breakfast because of the proximity of the approaching Tudor force. Still, their numbers are such that they line the entire ridge of the hill as Henry's army draws in sight of them. The rushed nature of the morning means, however, that they are confined to the hill in three distinct companies or battles. Richard's vanguard and forward battle are under the command of the Duke of Norfolk, with Richard and his own force in the centre, while the Earl of Northumberland commands a strong force in the rear, somewhat on the left flank. The Royal Army has cannon on its wings, along with archers across the front line, with infantry making up the brunt of its numbers and a smaller number of cavalry. There are also some accounts of springalds or torsion catapults that were capable of an impressive range when their bolts were fired into the midst of an enemy host. Richard sends a message to Lord Stanley, visible from the crest of the hill, to join with the Royal Army, but Stanley replies in a non-committal fashion. Henry's force is of the same composition as Richard's. Infantry spearmen armed with a variety of melee weapons, from simple spears to halberds and poleaxes, along with a mixture of armour, from the heavily protected nobleman covered head to toe, to the peasant soldier with only a battered helmet or a mail shirt. Henry has given command of his vanguard to John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, a veteran of the wars and rebellions of the previous decades. Now in his early 40s, Oxford was convicted of plotting against Edward IV as early as 1462, and though he has promised many times not to commit any further treason, he is an inveterate opponent of Richard and has given total support to Henry. Oxford marches his forces straight in the direction of Richard's camp, over the Sence Brook that winds off from the main river to the north around a hill, and he shows no signs of caution or avoidance of the approaching onslaught of Yorkist artillery and arrows. Henry too sends a message to the Stanleys, but the Lord replies only that he is at hand, and Henry should concentrate on the maneuvers necessary to engage his own force with the king's army. With no choice but to accept the battle, Richard orders Norfolk to move forward and attack once the rebel army has passed the marsh area to the southeast. Thomas Stanley's force of about 3,000 men come alongside the Tudor army, but do not engage it. Instead, Stanley's force seems to be facing the king's army on the hill. Richard's hope that the rebel army would either prevaricate or flee on sight of the size of the royal host, and at the sound of the cannon, have proven to be wishes made in vain. His second hope of assistance from the Stanleys has also been dashed. His chances of victory now depend on Norfolk's battle using the momentum of their charge down the hill to sweep the Tudor force backward and break their resolve. Oxford passes the marsh and arrows fly downward from Norfolk's front line, but the vanguard remains steady. Next, Oxford rushes down and the two battles are engaged in a melee. Both Richard and Henry are to the rear of this engagement, watching intently. Norfolk's charge fails to break Oxford, and the result is stalemate, with neither side able to break the other or maneuver for an advantage. Richard again sends word to Stanley that he should move against Henry, reminding the Lord that he holds his son as hostage, and his life will be forfeit if Stanley does not comply with the order. Stanley's reply, "I have other sons, my lord," sends Richard into a rage, and he gives the order that Lord Strange is to be executed. His companions convince him to belay the order and wait until the conclusion of the battle. Richard then turns to Northumberland and sends word that he is to engage the enemy, but the northern troops are directly behind both Richard and Norfolk's battles and unable to reach the front line. Richard is offered a faster horse than his heavy cavalry mount, with the suggestion that he consider withdrawal to fight another day. Richard dismisses the advice and states plainly he intends to fight for victory or die in the attempt. In the midst of the battle itself, Oxford's tightly packed formation seems the more sturdy of the two forces, with some of Norfolk's contingent beginning to withdraw to safety. Though Richard is by now agitated that the advantage they had at the outset of the engagement is lost, Henry too appears anxious on the possible outcome. From his vantage point, Oxford is fighting well, but even if his vanguard were to overcome Norfolk on the flat before advancing up Ambion Hill, there is still Richard's contingent and Northumberland's thousands on the high ground. Henry decides to make an attempt to signal the Stanleys himself, perhaps even appeal to them in person, and he moves his company from their rear position toward the right flank. From the high ground, Richard sees Henry come into view, possibly by his brightly colored costume or his standard. He makes the decision to attack. Donning his armor, Richard leads his force down the hill and wheels around the main fighting, making straight for Henry's position. Taking the small bodyguard of French knights and Welsh spearmen who surround Henry by surprise with the bold move, the charge is almost successful, and Richard manages to strike down a number of Henry's close guard and his standard-bearer before Henry dismounts and takes shelter amongst his knights, who close ranks around him, and the attack stalls. When it becomes clear that Henry has not fled the field, Thomas Stanley shows his hand and leads his men in a counter-charge on Richard's flank, and this has an even more devastating effect on the now outnumbered royal company. Richard and his remaining men are unhorsed, and again his companions give Richard the opportunity to flee the field while they cover his escape. Richard once more rejects the idea, still intent on either winning the day or dying as a king. Now pressed well back from Henry's company on the marsh line and far from any assistance from either Norfolk or Northumberland, he and his remaining men form up and make a final stand, surrounded on all sides. Richard's standard-bearer, Sir Percival Thirlwall, has his legs rent off, most likely with an axe, but he remains holding the banner. Richard's other companions are brought down by the savage melee weapons, and Richard himself eventually succumbs to the overwhelming numbers. Even though later Tudor propaganda made much of Richard's spinal deformity and alleged bad character, they were unanimous in their praise for the unflinching and warrior-like manner of his death, cut down in the thickest part of his enemy and still fighting. A blow to the back of the head kills Richard, though he suffers other wounds as the Welsh spearmen surround him. His company disintegrates, while in the centre of the battle, Norfolk too is killed, and his battle company folds, his remaining men either trying to flee or sue for terms from Oxford's victorious army. Northumberland withdraws his company and retreats to the north. Though he will later be arrested and held for a time by Henry Tudor, questions over his lack of action and possible treachery in the battle will dog him for the remainder of his life. Richard's body is stripped and carried back to Leicester, publicly paraded on the back of a horse in a ritual of humiliation. Once it has been seen by the populace, it is hastily buried in Greyfriars Church and becomes lost in time over the next tumultuous centuries before being rediscovered and ceremonially buried in 2015. Henry too moves to Leicester, and from there to London, where he is crowned king in August 1485. The following year, he marries Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV and niece of Richard III, thus bringing the two houses of Lancaster and York together and symbolically ending the Wars of the Roses. Don't forget to check out Top Troops. Use the link below or the QR code on screen to download the game. If you enjoyed watching, attack the like button and subscribe, and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. Support us on Patreon and get early access to our videos for as little as $1, or click the thanks button below to leave a one-time tip. As always, we'll see you in the next one.